Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateacherhistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateacherfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateacherhistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Today's episode is another in our three-part series on educating you and us through the research we do also on some various aspects of American politics with the election coming up. Last week, we did an election season special on the Supreme Court, the history of the court, and its role in our society and our politics. And today, we are doing an election season special on the Electoral College, which is probably the most impactful thing in American people's lives that they know basically nothing about. So we will be spending our time today talking about the history of the Electoral College, what role it plays today, and what the future of the Electoral College may or may not be. Next week, the week before the election, we will be dropping one more episode on the incumbency advantage and why it is so beneficial to run for re-election as opposed to being the challenger. But without further ado, Bill, I'll kick it over to you, because this whole three-part series is your brainchild. So, by the way, if you don't like it out there, blame Bill. But so far, we've gotten a lot of people reaching out saying that they do like it. So, Bill, congratulations on your above-average idea.
Well, what'd it do, Chris? I knew that, every once in a while I could contribute positively to this podcast endeavor. And I'm excited to talk about the Electoral College for all of the reasons you named, especially the timely nature of it. But this is the one for all the marbles. So, if you have been a longtime listener of this podcast or you are a relative newcomer, my guess is that if you enjoy learning about United States history, you are also likely paying attention to the elections that will be held on November 3rd. Millions of Americans will already cast their ballots by Tuesday the 3rd, which will directly impact the bottom line for local ordinances, ballot initiatives, local state houses, your congressperson, and your United States senator. But there are two elected officials where, when all is said and done and all the votes are counted, the person with the most popular votes may still not win the day. I am, of course, referring to the office of the president and vice president. And the reason for that dynamic is the subject of our special election series podcast today. Drum roll, please. Chris, you were a drummer. Can I get a little drum roll? Oh, I got a faint drum roll in there. Thank you.
Oh, wait, hold on.
Oh, there we go. The Electoral College. Odds are, that's the kind of production value you come to this podcast for, listeners. Odds are, if you have watched the news, hit refresh 1,000 times on a certain data journalist blog's election forecast, or just wondered how twice in the last 20 years did the person with the most votes not end up in the White House, you have heard about and read about the vestige of the late 18th and early 19th century. To understand why the history books don't mention President Al Gore and Vice President Joe Lieberman, or why President Hillary Clinton and Vice President Tim Kaine aren't running for re-election right now, we have to back all the way up to the Constitutional Convention. Now, the debate over how the president was to be elected was plentiful. Initially, under the Virginia Plan, and we're going way back here, listeners. This is throwback to earlier episodes, which Chris may be
this is Constitutional Convention, James Madison's brainchild.
Now, initially under the Virginia plan, Congress was to elect the president. There were also calls, notably by delegates from Pennsylvania and New York, for the president to be elected by a popular vote of the people. Now, Chris, want to take a stab at what Pennsylvania and New York had a lot of at this point in time? You got it.
Wait, actually, no. White men who own land.
So voters.
Yes,
exactly. You are correct. Well done. Now, on the flip side, delegates from South Carolina argued that a popular vote system would allow only a few of the larger states to decide the presidential election. The push and pull between the heavily populated states and the less populated states was, of course, a bit more nuanced, and it had a direct impact on the eventual Electoral College system we still have to this day. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention considered election by popular vote, the president being selected by Congress, and the president being elected by various state governors before ultimately compromising via the Electoral College system. Now, at the time, the Electoral College system was defended by some notable members of society. Alexander Hamilton outlined his vision and argument for the Electoral College. Famously, in Federalist 68, Hamilton wrote, quote, "It was desirable that the sense of the people should operate in the choice of the person to whom so important a trust was to be confided." But Hamilton also believed that, quote, "it was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choices." Hamilton in Federalist 68 lays to bear the tension that must have been palpable at the Constitutional Convention. That is, exactly how much say should we give the people when it comes to the election of the president? Ultimately, Hamilton believed, quote, "a small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations." Hamilton would later go on to write that the Electoral College served as a guardrail of sorts against electing someone ill-equipped for the office, or a tyrant, or a foreign infiltrator. To hammer this point home just a little bit more on Hamilton's thoughts on who should rise to the level of the office of the presidency, I have the following quote for you. "When a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, possessed of considerable talents, having the advantage of military habits, despotic in his ordinary demeanor, known to have scoffed in private at the principles of liberty, when such a man is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join in the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the general government and bringing it under suspicion, to flatter and fall in with all the nonsense of the zealots of the day, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind." End quote. Now, to unpack that, because I think as you were following along, if you were just trying to piecemeal that together about who or what type of person Hamilton was worried about, I think he was worried about a demagogue, but a very particular type of demagogue, unprincipled, uncouth, untoward, rejects democratic values and norms, doesn't believe the rule of law applies to him. Any of all of these things were contained in the fears that Alexander Hamilton, one of the framers, one of the our founding fathers had for who could rise to the office of the President of the United States.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Hamilton either. There were many founding fathers who agreed with him, and there was a reason to that, right? These educated, at the time, Americans at the time of the Constitutional Convention, the war's over, the Articles of Confederation are in place, and they understood their history, and they knew what had happened in the past when, in their mind, the uneducated electorate had been given too much power. And Zach, what are some of the and I didn't introduce you at the beginning, Zach, because Bill just took it and ran with it. But what are you gonna do? So Zach is on the pod too today, which is exciting. And Zach, what are some of the things these founding fathers were thinking about if they were debating how to elect their president of the United States?
So some of the context is that the founding fathers were their own students of history. And for them, being from the West, they had two great examples, Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic. And pretty universally, the founding fathers, being Englishmen, all frowned upon Athenian democracy. They viewed it as kind of a mob rule, a rabble-rousal. Famously, it was taken over by a pseudo-despot who was able to convince the will of the people, a man by the name of Alcibiades, who kind of helped speed up Athenian demise in the Peloponnesian War. But they really liked the Roman Republic. They thought Cicero, who was a great writer against Julius Caesar, was one of the great men, and they thought of themselves as small r Republicans, that they wanted to form a republic in the vestiges of the Roman Republic. So when we talked about George Washington, he liked to think of himself as a modern Cincinnatus, who was a Roman who was a successful general who then went back to the field. So they had that context, which was this Roman Republic style form of government. And within that Roman government, there was a position called the tribune, and the tribune represented the will of the plebes, the plebeians, who was the lower class, not the wealthy class of the patricians who made up the senatorial and the equitus class, the knights of the Roman Republic. And they've all kind of modeled and fashioned themselves and thought of themselves in that way. Madison famously talks in his own notes about the Constitutional Convention, talks about how he would study the Roman Republic and came up with this idea of what he thought would be a better version of Roman republicanism with this new American experiment. As an anecdote, since Bill brought up Alexander Hamilton, which as an aside, it's interesting that he's against the potential despot or tyrant emerging, given that he argued for a new American monarchy at the Constitutional Convention.
Allegedly.
Details.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
But and actually, when he made that argument, he so flabbergasted the New York delegation that they all left except for him. So
Yeah,
that's
I
why he's the
remember
only
that.
one there.
Yeah, everyone was just like jaw dropped as he's walking around talking about.
Show us the tape. Show us the tape.
This is part of what makes Hamilton actually very interesting is how he goes from saying, oh, we should have kind of a new monarchy in America to being such a defender of the Constitution in the Federalist Papers. But there is an anecdote in the George Washington administration where Hamilton is a part of it, as is Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson wasn't a very, he was more bookish, he was more pensive. And he wasn't as gregarious or loud in the room as someone like Hamilton was. And Hamilton was wanting to needle him. So he looked at him and said, Thomas, I think the greatest man in human history is Julius Caesar. And Thomas Jefferson is just like, can't even speak, he's so offended. And he writes in his journal later about like, oh, well, what I should have said at this moment to really zing Hamilton was this, right? But
it's like a straight George Costanza move.
Yeah,
that's what I should have
The
said.
jerk store is all out of you.
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of humanizes some of the friction and conflict. But what it really comes down to is, they viewed Caesar as a despot. He was popular with the plebes. He used the mechanisms in the Roman Republic to advance his objectives, and including having Mark Antony become a tribune. which was kind of done by popular election. So that's kind of the milieu of these guys as they're kind of creating this new system. Is they're thinking of the failure, their vision of the failures of Athenian democracy, and even the failures of the Roman Republic. Right, it becomes an empire, it becomes imperial, and that's kind of their mindset. So that's kind of what they're thinking of.
So the Athenian democratic structure didn't work. In their mind, the Roman Republican structure didn't work, obviously, because Julius Caesar just he ruined the whole thing, and then Caesar Augustus was the first emperor, and the rest is history. And then the British monarchy obviously didn't work. So they were trying to figure out a way, and without going too far down that rabbit hole, because this is about the Electoral College. Now, they came up with this system of the Electoral College, thinking it would be an indirect way to elect the president. It is democratic in that the people choose the electors, but it's in Republican form in that it's not a direct vote. Now, Bill, what role did slavery play in all of this, the creation of the Electoral College and the compromises that went into it?
Yeah, so this is the aspect of the conversation around the Electoral College that I think is oftentimes absent from the analysis.
I would agree, yeah.
And I think it is inexplicable why that is. So before we actually turn to the Electoral College's actual appearance in our Constitution, I want to just take you through a fairly quick analysis of why I think the institution of slavery, the Electoral College is one of the last vestiges of that institution. That is still codified
and by
today.
the way, I do just want to clarify for the listener, while Bill is in agreement, this is like commonly understood history in American historian circles. So it's not like you're going off the grid here and putting together puzzle pieces that are not that do not clearly go together. Yeah,
if this was a novel thought, we'd be in bad shape.
Yeah,
or worse shape, I guess. Depending on your view of things. So I'd like to talk quickly then about how the Electoral College wasn't just a compromise from the perspective of how the passions and whims of men may be curbed by a tribe of elders actually responsible for electing the president. It was also a compromise rooted in the institution of slavery, period. By the time the Electoral College was settled upon, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had already worked out that enslaved peoples were to be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives and apportionment of taxes. The delegates tied the number of presidential electors, those voting for president in the Electoral College, to its representation in Congress. Now, as written in a 2002 Cardoza Law Review article, quote, "In electing the president, the political power Southerners gained from owning slaves would be factored in to the electoral votes of each state," end quote. The Electoral College is logically, rationally, provably a vestige of the institution of slavery. And then I just want to take a couple more moments to go through a couple other notes about the legacy of slavery and its impact and its prevalence within the Electoral College system. Now, efforts in the 1820s to move to a national popular vote were quashed explicitly by Southern enslaving states, famously Virginia. The United States Senator from Virginia, James Barber, said he would oppose even a committee to study a national popular vote because then there would be no power or electoral influence derived from the number of enslaved peoples in those states. And the electoral power of Southern former enslaving states was magnified after the Civil War, when their formerly enslaved populations were no longer counted as 3/5, but as a whole for purposes of congressional representation, but due to Jim Crow era laws, were still not able to vote.
Yeah, and I think that that's one point that was oftentimes lost when I would teach this, is that how following the Civil War and after, the Southern states finally bent the knee and came back into the U.S., some taking longer than others, each individual African-American freedman in the South now counted as an entire person, not 3/5, but because the Jim Crow laws in many areas, especially following the Compromise of 1876, were so oppressive that they got the representation in Congress and the electoral votes provided to them because these freedmen were now counted as citizens, but overwhelmingly they could not vote. So their voice wasn't really heard, which I don't know if ironic is the right term, but in an unfortunate circumstance, African Americans, in many ways, following the Civil War, going from being 3/5 of a person in representation to a whole person, actually further empowered the white former slave-owning socioeconomic class, because now African Americans are counted as a whole person, but the voter suppression was so rampant that barely any of them could vote.
So to wrap up this section on the background, compromise, and codification of the Electoral College, we now turn to its appearance in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1 addresses how each state will appoint their number of electors, the procedure the electors follow to vote, including what happens in the event of an elector's tie, and the timing of the actual elector's vote itself. Now, Chris and I are going to go kind of piece by piece through Article 2, Section 1, and then subsequent amendments that actually impacted how the Electoral College is to function. Now, some of what was included in Article 2 was amended just a few years later through the 12th Amendment. And now we're going to go through how that was impacted. First,
and the 12th Amendment, no, the 12th Amendment was the only amendment that we've ever had that altered the Electoral College. And that will be important because we'll talk about, proposed amendments to alter the Electoral College
substantively,
later,
yes. But there were a couple others that actually augmented it, not altered it. Yeah. So first, in terms of how the 12th Amendment altered the Electoral College system, first, each party nominated their team for president and vice president.
Yeah, and that's what we see today with Biden and Harris and Trump and Pence. And this all started, and you guys might remember from listening to these episodes, it came up in 1796, and it came up again in 1800. So in 1796, it was Adams versus Jefferson. Each elector at the time voted for two people, and the person who came in second would be VP. Now, the Federalists had a plan that they were going to vote for Adams and Thomas Pinckney, and the plan was to throw one vote away for Pinckney, so then Adams would have the most and Pinckney would come in a close second. But that plan, which seemed pretty straightforward, they messed it up. And Thomas Jefferson actually got the second most votes, and the Democratic Republican was the vice president to the Federalist president, which wasn't the most effective way of governing. And then in 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were running the more popular ticket as Democratic Republicans, and it was the same against John Adams, and it was the same plan. Someone was supposed to throw away a vote for Burr, but they didn't do that, and Thomas Jefferson and Burr ended up with the same amount of votes. So the two men tied. And now the Congress that was in place at the time was still a Federalist-dominated Congress, and they had to take a few dozen votes. I believe it was exactly 3 dozen votes, 36 votes, before eventually, with the help of Alexander Hamilton and others, they chose Thomas Jefferson. And one thing to remember here is that if somehow there is no majority in the Electoral College, and that's why it went to the House, because Jefferson and Burr tied, so no one had 51%. If there's no majority, it goes to the House, but each individual member of the House of Representatives does not vote. What happens is each state gets one vote, and all the delegates from that state have to choose one person to vote for. So it's not just like a straight up one man, one vote in Congress either. Or in the House, if it were to go to that.
Thanks for stealing my thunder, Chris, because point number 2 of what the 12th Amendment did to Article 2, if there is no majority, actually, I still got something here, so you didn't steal everything from me, Chris. If there is no majority, the House of Representatives by state delegations select a new president from the top 3 candidates. And that has been reduced from the initial top 5, which was included in Article 2 initially.
Yeah.
Not initially, but in Article 2.
Yeah, and we see that happen in the corrupt bargain of 1824. So I mentioned 1800, right? And then we see it happen in the corrupt bargain of 1824, in which John Quincy Adams wins over Andrew Jackson, because while Andrew Jackson had the popular vote and was clearly the most popular candidate who ran, he did not have a majority. In 1876, and we'll get to this later in the podcast, obviously, a deal was struck. And unfortunately, African Americans in the South were more or less hung out to dry by the Republican Party and sent to be run by the Redeemers. And that's the beginning of Southern redemption and the end of Reconstruction. In 2000, we have Bush v. Gore, which actually went to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, ended the recount in Florida, which, for all intents and purposes at the time, meant that George Bush would be president. And then just in our most recent election, 2016, Clinton won by 3 million votes, but Trump won the Electoral College. And so we have seen instances where candidates don't win a majority, and it's gone to the House of Representatives, like in the corrupt bargain and 1876 when they had to strike a deal. And then we've seen in other cases where the candidate who wins the popular vote in 2000 and 2016 does not win the electoral vote. And, you know, that stuff is really important. Bush, I think in his 8 years, put 3 people on the Supreme Court. Trump has served for almost 4 years now, and it's looking more and more likely that he will put 3 people on the Supreme Court. So really some lasting impacts of the current structure we have here, having the Electoral College as opposed to a national popular vote. Zach?
Yeah, so the couple things, the Compromise of 1871, or did I get that wrong?
1876.
76, pardon me, 1876. I don't think people quite realize how close to calamity that really was. So basically, you have a disputed election in the southern states. There's violence at the polls. The way voting is done is very different than it is now. It's not a secret ballot. It's you basically go, you vote in public, you rally literally around a poll. There's massive violence across the states that still have federal troops. They're still run by Republicans that haven't been redeemed yet. And it's kind of like nobody really knows who's won. It goes kind of to the House of Representatives. They kind of want to say the Republicans win. There's, it's almost like, are we going to have a second Civil War? And they go to a committee that just happens to have one extra Republican than it does Democrats, and under an implicit agreement to basically end Reconstruction and abandon the 14th, 5th, and 15th Amendments, nominally the 13th Amendment as well. Hayes is given the presidency, and of course he actually ends up being assassinated. So I just want to bring up, because that's something that we kind of write over. It's like, oh, Reconstruction ends. It's like, no, this was like the first moment that this crisis where the Electoral College didn't create a decisive result came, and it really almost had serious consequences for the country. One could argue that the United States basically has had 4 republics. There's the founding republic, then there's the Civil War, there's the Reconstruction Republic, then there's the post-Reconstruction Republic, and then there's the post-Civil Rights Republic. Not trying to get into too many details around that kind of thesis, but basically that there was this founding period, there was then a civil war to resolve some issues, there was then a crisis that created a peace, and then in the 1960s there was a resolution to those outstanding issues. So,
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I never really thought about it broken up like that, but it certainly makes sense.
So it's super, super critical to understand like how earth-shattering that was. What's interesting about, to also go forward into the 60s, when George Wallace did really well, who was a segregationist candidate, there was an effort then to reform and get rid of the Electoral College because people were really afraid that something bad could happen again with the Electoral College. And it basically just kind of died. Of course, now we're in this new situation where I think some people are wondering out loud if there's democratic legitimacy if the Electoral College is going to continue to produce presidential winners without necessarily the popular mandate. Now, that's a whole other can of worms that we're going to get to later. But I just want to really reiterate how the 1876 election was a really close-run thing that I don't think we quite understand.
Yeah, it was a really big deal, and it's something we'll dive into in great detail when we get there for sure. And I'm glad you took the time to really nail that down, because I do think I sort of just breezed over it a bit too much here. Bill, what other changes have been made? What else did the 12th Amendment say?
Just one last piece on the 12th Amendment. It extended the eligibility requirements to become president to the vice president as well. So natural born, at least 35 years old, must be a resident of the United States for 14 years. Now, I mentioned, Chris, that there were two other amendments that augmented the Electoral College. And so that's the 20th Amendment, which set deadlines on these electoral events that you had previously gone through. And then the 23rd Amendment, which gave electors to the District of Columbia.
Gotcha. Very good. Now I'd like to, I think it's time for us to now get into the nuts and bolts of the Electoral College and answer a lot of questions that people probably have about it. And hopefully the second part of this episode will be able to fill in those blanks for you. The most common question I would always get when I taught government and politics was, who are the electors and how are they chosen? And that is a very difficult question to answer, because every state operates differently in how they choose their electors. Electors are chosen, for the most part, during state convention. So each convention, it's with one party. So, in Maryland, my home state, there'd be a Democratic convention and a Republican convention. And that's where the electors are chosen. And they're choosing to swear, sometimes on a Bible, to vote for a certain candidate if the state votes that way. So all of the electors in Maryland would choose or would swear to vote for Joe Biden or swear to vote for Donald Trump if the state of Maryland votes that way. And the overwhelming odds are that the state of Maryland will vote for Joe Biden, because they vote for a Democrat every time. So, and there are other states that go the other way for sure. It gets a little more nuanced in some states, but it's not worth diving too deep into in this episode. California has a bunch of crazy rules because they can. They're California. They just do whatever they want. But one thing is, an elector cannot be in office of trust or profit. So, like, no mailman can be an elector. Sorry, buddy. But you are disqualified. Now, when you vote as an elector, when you vote as an individual, so when I fill out my ballot and vote, I am not voting technically for the president and the vice president. Technically, I'm voting for the electors in the state of Maryland chosen to represent them. So if I fill in my sheet for Trump, I'm technically voting for those electors that promised they would go vote for Trump, and same thing for Biden. Now, in most states, they have a presidential short ballot, which basically just skips that step. And in other states, they have like a little disclaimer in there, like, hey, by the way, technically, according to our Constitution, you're not actually voting for these candidates. But, we know what you mean. They meet the electors meet on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December to cast their votes. And interestingly, there are no safeguards to prevent the bribing of an elector. I mean, there are laws in place, but there's nothing really that can be done to change the process. So, I mean, obviously, there are legal ramifications, but not political ones as of now. So, the next question I would always get is, why 538 and total electors, and why do you need 270 to win? Well, Bill, you and I messed this up. I don't know, like a dozen episodes ago. We messed up the 538. We got it wrong. I can't remember why.
So,
we were
I
saying
thought
535.
I got tripped up because I think there are 535 members of Congress. And I got slipped up there. But I'll take the L on that.
Okay. So I just want to point out all of the residents of Washington, D.C. listening to this. Bill clearly doesn't think you exist because that's where the other three come from. So why 538? Well, those 3 votes for D.C. Came in the 23rd Amendment in 1961. Bill, look it up. They are people. They deserve your recognition. Then you have 100 in the Senate and 435 in the House. And let's say I'm not a math magician, but that would be 538. Now, why you need 270? Well, because you need a majority of the electoral votes. Majority of 538 is 270. Did that math in my head. No big deal. And if you don't get a majority, then it goes to Congress. And you don't want that. It goes to the House. Now, you may say, wow, D.C. gets 3 votes? That's a lot for one little, square on the Potomac. Well, D.C. has more people than the entire state of Vermont and more people than the entire state of Wyoming. Now, you may wonder, why 3 votes? Well, 3 is the minimum that you can get. So you have 1 elector for each member of Congress that represents your state. So a less populous state like Wyoming will have 1 member of the House of Representatives and 2 members of the Senate. And so therefore they will have 3 votes. There isn't a state that you will see that will have less than 3 votes. Zach?
So if you've ever been to D.C., the people there on their license plate, it typically says no taxation without representation. And my father grew up in D.C. and tells stories about how big of a deal it was to actually get votes in the Electoral College and get the right to vote. Because basically everybody who lived in D.C. had no voting rights because Congress runs the District of Columbia. There was basically some deals made later on so that the city could have its own city government, but technically Congress can at any time overrule that. So anyways, that's part of why we added DC not as a state, but gave them electoral college votes.
And I mean, it totally makes sense, and I can see why the people of DC would be frustrated with not having a vote
right.
in the presidential election.
Yeah, and I think it is not ironic that they chose the slogan "No taxation without representation."
Yes, I would agree with that. Now, 48 of the 50 votes. So all of the states have anywhere between 3 electoral votes, and I believe California's at 55. Pretty sure it's at 55.
That's right. Yep, that's right.
So anywhere between 3 and 55 electoral votes. Remember, 3 is the minimum. Now, 48 of these 50 states use a winner-take-all system, which means that if you get the plurality of the votes in the state, not majority, but a plurality of the votes in the state, you get all of the electoral votes. So if you're an elector in the state of California for a Republican, say for Trump and Pence, and you are chosen at the state convention to be an elector for Trump and Pence, well, the overwhelming odds are that California is going to vote in very large margins for Biden and Harris, which means that you will not be able to cast your vote as an elector for Trump and Pence, and all of the Biden-Harris electors will be able to cast theirs. Maine and Nebraska, so I mentioned 48 of the 50 states use winner-take-all. Maine and Nebraska don't do this. They actually have a district voting plan where each district gets a vote. So if Biden wins one district, an elector will vote for him. If Trump wins the other district, an elector will vote for him. Whichever candidate wins the overall popular vote of the state gets the 2 bonus electors that represent the Senate. And we'll touch on that again in just a few minutes.
Chris, I got one.
Yeah, sure.
So it's actually that you would think to yourself, well, how often does that actually come into play? The bi-congressional district apportionment of electoral votes. But actually it happened in both 2016 and 2008. 2016, Donald Trump won a congressional district in Maine. And then in 2008, Barack Obama won the 2nd congressional district, I believe, which is Omaha in the state of Nebraska. So it actually has kind of happened like more than I think anyone would, at least on spec, think it would happen. So it actually comes up quite a bit. And if you look at Electoral College math for the 2020 election, you can see that those congressional districts and how those electors are apportioned in Nebraska and Maine are quite competitive in the 2020 presidential election cycle as well.
Yeah, and I've also seen some projections where they literally, and it's not totally far-fetched, but they literally could be the deciding vote.
Yeah, the one from Nebraska could be like the 270. Yeah, it could be 270.
Yep, exactly. Now, technically, it's still possible in states where technically, state legislatures can appoint a state's electors no matter what the people do. That is possible, but that's not likely to ever happen. So if you read some news articles or read some frantic people on social media talking about some type of like state legislator coup in certain states, that technically it could happen, but if they were to do it, they would have already done it by now. Now, you may be asking, if you swear to vote for an individual candidate, do you have to vote for them? And technically, in our history, the answer would be no. And if you change your mind or vote for someone else, you will be a faithless elector. Now, about 33 states have laws prohibiting that. And the Supreme Court said that, yes, states can have laws punishing a faithless elector, but that doesn't mean that they can't do it, right? The deed has already been done. Now, a faithless elector has never made a difference, and really you'll see like one faithless elector here or there. There have been 165 total in our history, but over 1/3 of them happened in 1872 when Horace Greeley died in between the election and the actual electors voting. In that month, he died, and so, of course, a large majority of them just threw their vote to Grant. They're not going to vote for a dead guy. And then, as a protest, there were 10 different Hillary Clinton electors that did protest votes and voted for a handful of different people when they realized that, obviously, Donald Trump had won the election by a decent margin, and so it wasn't going to matter anyway. So they did some protest voting to show, in their opinion, why the Electoral College wasn't really valuable, that they could vote for random people and it wouldn't really impact the outcome. Okay, so moving on from, what the Electoral College is, who these electors are, why 538, why do you need 270? Now it's to all the other questions I would get. First question, number one, what do we need to do to get rid of this thing? Right? Some people really like the Electoral College. Other people don't. I'm not taking a stance one way or another, but there are definitely people out there on both sides. I'm totally both sides in this one. Now, what you would need to do is you would need to amend the Constitution. You say, well, what do you have to do to amend the Constitution? Oh, fancy you should ask. You need to get 2/3 of Congress to approve the proposed amendment, and 3/4 of the states, which is 38 states. That is a lot of states, by the way. So the odds of it ever happening are slim to none. Slim to none. Now, there are some real drawbacks to abolishing it. Look, naturally, we can look at the election of 2000 and 2016 and say, wait, hold on a second. This does not seem very democratic. And you could argue we need to get rid of it because it's one man, one vote. Additionally, some people argue that you should get rid of it because, during these presidential election seasons, states are almost treated like political entities as opposed to states full of people, right? Because there are blue states and red states. We've heard this a lot, especially during Donald Trump's presidency, where he'll oftentimes refer to states as blue states or Democrat states. And if you were to eliminate the Electoral College, a candidate would not be focusing on Democrat states or Republican states because each individual's vote is important. So someone like Donald Trump would want to go to California where there are a ton of people, and he want to talk to Californians and he want to campaign and rally there because each vote matters. But under our circumstances, there's really no reason for someone like him to campaign in California, just like there's no reason for Joe Biden to campaign in Oklahoma or West Virginia, because is not going to be worth their time because it's winner take all. And they would also argue that if you get rid of the Electoral College, there would not be states that would be taking up all of the attention of the candidates, like these swing states, such as Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arizona, potentially Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada some years, this year Georgia and Texas, and North Carolina. And so you only have about 10 to 15 states that really get all of the attention of the candidates and of the media. And so they would say, if now, going back to my earlier point, now the candidates will sort of spread the love, so to speak. Now, the drawbacks of abolishing the Electoral College. Well, rural states would argue that if you were to do that, then a candidate is only going to go to all the most populous cities. They're not going to care about states like Iowa. They're not going to focus on these more rural states that don't have huge total populations but are still Americans, and they are important. Additionally, what they would argue is that we are set up in a Democratic-Republican constitution, and we have indirect representation, and the founding fathers did it for a reason. Now, the changes we've made to the Electoral College over the years have basically taken all of the spirit out of the Electoral College that the founding fathers had originally envisioned, but nonetheless, that's what they would argue. Now, I will tell you, I told you that the odds of the Electoral College going away are slim to none. And I'll tell you this is really why. Not only does the constitutional amendment need 2/3 of Congress and 38 states, but the Electoral College preserves the two-party system. And this is what other proponents of the Electoral College would argue. They would argue that if we got rid of the Electoral College, it could potentially rid us of the two-party system. If that were the case, then there would most likely never be a majority, and you would have situations where a president could potentially become president of the United States by only winning 20, 25, or 30% of the popular vote, which would not seem to be much of a mandate from the people. And if you had Congress full of 3 or 4 or 5 different political parties, imagine the potential gridlock you would have in Congress. Right now, we only have 2 parties, and Congress, well, their approval ratings like in single digits. So the American people do not think they're very productive. Zach, did you want to jump in here?
So why would they think that ending the Electoral College would break the two-party system? I thought the two-party system is largely a fact of the winner-take-all nature of elections in the United States.
Well, think about it this way. If you were to get rid of the Electoral College and it went to a totally popular vote, right, then you could have people like, say a John Kasich or a Mitt Romney could run, or a more liberal Democrat could run. And because the winner-take-all nature of the vote is now removed, there's a much better chance that a third-party candidate could win the election or legitimately compete in the election. If they can bank that they'll come in second or a close third in almost every state, then it could give them a very realistic chance of winning if they have a message that appeals broad enough. As of now, with the Electoral College system we have set up, and because it is a winner-take-all, if you're not confident that you will win half of the states, then there's really then you don't stand any chance of competing for victory. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I think, though, you'd still end up with a spoiler effect, where that's been pretty much the history of the United States, is any attempt to form a third party or to break up the two parties have fallen flat because of spoiler problems. So.
Yep. No, I would agree with that. I still think that
it's an interesting argument, though. I had never heard that people thought that getting rid of the Electoral College would actually hurt the two-party system.
Yeah, I mean, well, think about it this way. If you're a third party running, so let's just throw out a third party like the
you do the Ross Perot case because he didn't win any states, but got, I think, like 18% of the vote or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, he sabotaged his own campaign too. And he still got 18 or 20% of the vote. He was polling at 25 or 30%. And even in those situations, he basically had zero chance of winning the presidency. So, and that's because of the Electoral College. Now, another reason why I think, and when I say never, I mean like not anytime soon. This is October of 2020. So,
well, I think one of the things that you could also point out is, so I mean, I live in Texas, and one of the interesting things that has happened is as the state has become more competitive, the state Republican Party is arguing for adopting an electoral college type system as opposed to statewide elections being determined by a popular vote. So that would give you an inclination that individuals who think a certain system benefits them would be more than willing to implement that system. And that goes for abolishing the Electoral College and doing popular votes. So.
Yeah,
I want to pile on here, Chris.
Okay.
Because I obviously, personal thoughts aside, I often hear the refrain when this subject comes up about how, well, rural or less populated states would get less attention. You had mentioned that in one of your earlier reasons why the Electoral College likely will be here for the long haul. And I saw a graphic over the weekend as I was preparing for this podcast, which you also forwarded on, which denied me the ability to ambush you with it completely. But I'm holding it up now for the Patreon viewers, and it's a map of the United States with the ad buys from the Biden and Trump campaigns. And if you are under the impression or the illusion that the current system leads to greater exposure in rural or less populated areas, you are gravely mistaken. The current system, where campaigns spend their money, which is one of the two finite resources in political campaigns, money is one, time is the other. When 50% of your finite resources manifest themselves in the most heavily populated areas, you are fooling yourself if you think the current system is looking out for the zero ad buys in Wyoming, the zero ad buys in Idaho, the zero ad buys in South Dakota. I just wanted to pile on there.
Well,
you can go on.
Yeah.
On top of that, I also saw a graphic that the southern portion of Manhattan has basically the exact same Manhattan Island. The southern portion of Manhattan Island has almost the exact same population of South Dakota, and the northern portion of Manhattan Island has almost the exact same population as North Dakota. I think it was 8/5.
Yeah, and the other way to look at this too is there's 4 million people in California who voted for Trump, and those votes don't matter because the state went one way or the other. And the current situation, I apologize for kind of putting opinion in here, but there's basically lots of wasted votes in the system, and those wasted votes discourage people from participating in the political process. Texas is a state that has the fewest turnout, has one of the lowest turnout rates in the country, and a lot of people think that's because the state had politics that were dominated by one party for so long. And before the Republican Party dominated, it was dominated by the Democratic Party for basically 100 years. Because of Reconstruction.
And I totally agree with you, Zach. And it's that is very real, very real. I remember when I was teaching this stuff, and like I said, I'm in Maryland, and Maryland is just a heavily, heavily Democratic state. Polls close at 8:00, and at 8:01, all the news stations are like, and we feel comfortable calling Maryland for the Democratic candidate. And it will happen again, November 3rd, 8:01, they'll be like, and polling results are in, and Maryland has voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, right? Just like it does in other Republican states. And I would get all the time questions from students like, well, why should I vote then? Like, honestly, why should I vote? And I'm not like, look, I had trouble answering that question. Like, giving them a practical reason why they should take a day off of work, when they're old enough to vote and go vote, or stand out in the cold, or stand out in the rain. Like, obviously, I can tell them all the reasons in my heart. Like, well, because it's really important that you vote. You have to go through the process. There are, senators and representatives and local officials on the ballot. Like, of course, right? I can go through all of that. But they're like, yeah, but if I'm just going to vote for the president, and if whether I vote for the Democrat or the Republican, Maryland is almost guaranteed to go Democrat no matter what, then why vote? I'd be like, well, because you should. I don't know. Like, I didn't have a great argument. And you're right that the Electoral College creates voter suppression, like serious voter suppression, like self-inflicted. Because it is like when you recognize that your vote doesn't matter. And then I used to, as we all did, because we met in college, we all used to live in Ohio. Ohio is a huge swing state. Are you kidding me? Like, if I lived in Ohio, my vote would be so much more valuable than it is in Maryland. I mean, so much more valuable.
We were the belle of the ball.
Yeah, I would be the belle of the ball. Absolutely, you're
can
right.
Can we talk hard and fast numbers on vote value?
Sure.
So,
yes.
You mentioned
don't go too hard and too fast, but I do want to talk numbers.
Okay. So you had mentioned value, but I think that was much more of an intrinsic feeling of how your vote would be valued, in that it, like, maybe more meaningful, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm a touchy-feely guy.
But so I'm going to approach this from a slightly different angle. But the result of the 3-vote minimum in the Electoral College, sort of like a 3-drink minimum when we used to be allowed to go to comedy clubs in person. The effect of the 3-vote minimum in the Electoral College means, and I don't think this is opinion, because these are the hard and fast numbers. That means the voter in the state of Wyoming, their vote proportionally is 68 times more valuable than a voter in California's, due to the Electoral College system. So
that's not assuming any type of like obvious historical trend lines of the state of California going Democratic, like no matter what happens. That's just taking like just the pure value of the vote.
Correct. People can fact check me on the exact numbers, but it is pretty. I mean, the discrepancy is pretty wide between the literal value of a person's vote vis-a-vis the Electoral College's system and the 3-vote minimum. So I think talking about vote value from both the perspective of the hard and fast numbers of how that impacts you, but also from what Zach and you were talking about when it comes to someone's motivation because you feel your vote is more valuable or less valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And so, I mean, with all of that, you may think like, well, how can we stick with the Electoral College? How can we not get rid of it? Why are people against getting rid of it? And people would ask, like, Chris, why are you so sure it's not going to happen anytime soon? Well, 2 different groups of states would never go along with this. It makes no practical sense to them. Number one, as we just mentioned, the rural states, right? So many of the Great Plains states would never want to go along with this. States with very low populations like Alaska, Hawaii, Vermont, Delaware would never want to go along with this because their vote is more valuable. Basically, if you have like 12 electoral votes or less, your vote is weighed heavier than if you have more than 12, based on just like the rough math. Additionally, there are bigger states that also would not go for this. Those would be the swing states. Those Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Arizona, potentially Nevada, potentially North Carolina, Florida for sure. They get so much attention. Their state issues are at the forefront of public debate. Like, there's a reason why the word fracking has been mentioned like 1,000 times over the last month, when 99% of Americans are like, what is fracking and why does Vice President Pence care so much about fracking? And that's because of Pennsylvania. And it's a big part of their economy there, especially in the rural areas where you could have a potential Obama, Trump, Biden voter. And they want to keep that Obama, Trump voter a Trump voter. And so they want to make sure that they stay on message. I think Pence said the word 4 or 5 times in the vice presidential debate, and 99% of America have either no idea what fracking is or it doesn't impact their life at all. And that's all because of the swing states. So rural states, small states, and swing states would never go for getting rid of the Electoral College because they'd be voting directly against their state's interest. It doesn't make any sense. And when you need 38 votes, you can only have 12 defections. And I just named about 20 different states that would never want to go for this. So that's why the Electoral College exists. That's what the Electoral College is. That is how it works, and that's why we're not getting rid of it really anytime soon. Before we log off, Bill or Zach, any last words, anything you'd like to mention?
Can I give the counter to why the Electoral College might disappear sooner rather than later?
Sure. Yeah, let's hear it.
The Electoral College is becoming a partisan issue. So as it becomes a partisan issue, there is the potential that that a state that fits your criteria as a swing state or a small state that it would be against their interest to vote for it, they might actually vote for it because it's partisan, right?
True.
So, and then the other thing is our last experience with an amendment is the Equal Rights Amendment, the Women's Equal Rights Amendment, which was written with a time limit. The amendment process actually doesn't have a time limit. It was just that specific amendment was. So realistically, you could have multiple states start passing amendment saying the president is determined by raw popular vote. And within 10, 15 years, just one day, like Rhode Island randomly passes it and it's like, those are the rules. So that's kind of the more positive, or that if you were someone who was not interested in the Electoral College, I would say the other reason why we have it is basically it's a unique component of American culture. And same way that there's talk about adding extra states to the union, 50 is a nice round number. It makes a lot of sense. There's 100 senators. I think people are a little resistant to that idea. But 2 states were added basically within 70 years, 70 years ago, like in the 50s. So this was a normal thing that would happen fairly regularly. And South and North Dakota were both added specifically to give the Gilded Age Republicans 2 extra senators. So there's been a long history of this.
So, well, Zach, I was jumping in because I come down on your side, on your take. And we don't even have to go back very far. I think, Chris, you might have mentioned it during your examination of the Electoral College a little earlier. But the most recent vote to shift to a national popular vote and away from the Electoral College system was in 1968 when it passed the House of Representatives. You were talking, I believe, at that point in time about the George Wallace era South. And in response to that in 68, the House of Representatives actually passed a national popular vote system. And it died in the United States Senate under another relic of perhaps anti-democratic principle, the filibuster, during the 60s. So I think it may be more likely than you may give it credit that the Electoral College may be on the ropes. I agree that it is unlikely, but I think there is semi-recent history to support that it is not the pipe dream that perhaps you made it out to be.
Yeah, I also see what you're saying, Bill, and I respectfully disagree in that, respectfully, okay, I'm being very respectful, in that if you think the House of Representatives passing an amendment is even close to that amendment actually being ratified,
It is not. It is
Judith
not.
Priest would say you got another thing coming.
It's not.
Because
it was simply a piece of evidence to support my proposition. I'm not saying
I know.
it is definitive.
Totally understand. No. And I'm not saying that your piece of evidence was non-existent. I'm just saying it's a bad piece of evidence. And that is the entire foundation for your argument. Thus, ipso facto, bad argument.
It should provide reasonable doubt to the listener.
I understand.
It is within the realm of possibility.
Sure, it is within the realm of possibility. I think my biggest thing is I can't see 38 states going along with it. I actually think Zach's take that it could go, you could get these swing states like, look, a national popular vote, the trend line would show that it would favor a Democratic candidate, right? I mean, that's just objective data, right? Look at 2000, 2016. And there is a world in which the state legislatures of swing states like Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, other Midwest states, Arizona, could potentially be democratically held, where even though they recognize, those Democrats in the state legislature recognize, like, yeah, this is going to hurt us come election season, our state, when it comes to the attention on the state. By changing this, it will really bolster the chances for a Democratic candidate to win moving forward. So even though we're a swing state and we get a ton of attention, we can get on board with that. Now, that would be very likely wildly unpopular in that state. And it would potentially be political career suicide in the state to go along with something like that. But you can see how in the bigger picture, nationally, someone could go along with that.
I kind of think of it like Iowa. So Iowa goes first in the primaries, and that might not be long for this world if anyone can remember what happened in the beginning of 2020 with the primary in Iowa. But by going first, that state's policy preferences are predominant at a national level. So
corn and soybeans.
Yep.
Everybody in America here is all about the price of corn and the price of soybeans.
Yeah, and there's pretty big subsidies right now protecting those in the midst of the current trade war in the United States, between the United States and China. Now, I would say that there's a different argument that you could make is, so here in Texas, people are experiencing political ads for the first time that we all experience quite frequently in Ohio. And I don't think people are very happy about it. So you want to basically be like, look, do you want these ads to go away? You know what's the best way for these ads to go away is actually a national vote. And the reason why is because in the current climate, there's basically just a few states that are critical. So where does the money get spent that creates the ads? They get spent in critical media markets in those states. So you could very easily, and say Texas is the swing state in 2024. All the ads are going to be bought for Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston suburbs. And if you think about it, it's like, should we really determine an election for a country of 350 million based upon 800,000 voters in a single state? It just, I don't, part of me is just kind of like, maybe we can do something different. I don't know. And I agree with you. And the option, so the next question is like, what are the options, right? And so we've talked about the direct popular vote. And I talked about a potential drawback for that because you could get a candidate who really doesn't have an overwhelming vote from the electorate becoming president, a mandate. There's also, you could go to the district plan like Maine and Nebraska have. But, and we'll probably talk about this in an episode at some point, the gerrymandering that goes on at the state level is embarrassing. Well, that's why you can't do the congressional district. It only works for small states that only have like one or two congressional districts.
Yep,
because
for sure, and I agree, because then the gerrymandering would become even more valued, and the state lines would become even more corrupted.
Yeah.
Then there's a proportional plan, which I'm a fan of, in which a candidate would get a proportion of the popular vote. So if, Donald Trump wins 40% of the popular vote in California and Joe Biden wins 60%, then Biden would get 60% of those 55 votes. Trump would get 40% of those 55 votes. And that's basically just like one, sort of in some ways, one step removed from the popular vote. But I don't think that's the worst idea. And then there's this crazy idea. And this technically could happen. It's the Popular Vote Interstate Compact Plan. And that would be if there were enough votes for over 270, enough states came together that have votes that could go to over 270, and they decide to give their electoral votes to the person the popular vote goes for, no matter who their state goes for. Then, now, would that be complicated? Yes. Would that infuriate a lot of people? Yep. But that could happen. Technically, it could happen.
They've got like 19 states in D.C. at this point, don't they?
Yeah, but I don't think the Supreme Court would let that stand.
Well, yeah, I mean, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. That's just a whole other conversation. We're just dealing in hypotheticals, like what the potential. We don't need to tease out the hypothetical result of the hypothetical action.
For the record, Pew has actually polled semi-recently the popularity of a national popular vote. I haven't seen it state by state, but Pew has it at 65% in favor of turning to a national popular vote. It is not as popular, Pew found, when the question is posed to poll participants that the Constitution has to be amended for that to happen. When that is inserted into the question, it was 55% are in favor. Still majorities, though, nationally.
Makes sense. Well, it makes sense. People don't like change, man. So you throw in constitutional amendment, and they're like, hold on a second. So, all right. Wrapping up for the second time. Any last words, Bill or Zach? No? Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, guys. Really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully, you who are listening are a bit more informed now about the Electoral College. And if you're listening while we're dropping it live, then you'll know more about it as we lead up to the 2020 election. If you're not, then, well, at least now you know more about the Electoral College. And thanks for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.